Hi, friends. How many of you are suffering from cabin fever? Now, that's an idiom. How many of you know what that really means? Yes, that idiom means that you are sick and tired of being stuck inside. But we're doing it for a very good cause, because by staying inside, that means we are working together to try to get this terrible, terrible virus under control. So, we left off at the end of chapter 2 in Frindle. And I'll bet you're wondering, why does she keep holding up this pen? And I'll remind you that several weeks ago, I sent out a free library and gave you a login and a password. And all your parents had to do was to download an app on any kind of device called Open eBooks. And I have Open eBooks, and it's right here on my phone. Hold on there. So when I tap it, hold on here, I can search for Frindle, and then I just keep swiping through the pages until I get to chapter 3, titled The Question. And you can read right along with me as I read from the chapter book, Frindle. And as we left off, we had Nick saying it was still a week before school, and Nick already felt like 5th grade was going to be a very long year. So think, what had happened in that last chapter that made Nick believe that 5th grade was going to be a very long year? That's right. He has a teacher who has a reputation of being very tough. Now, I don't think it means that she's very mean. I think it means that she has very high expectations for her students. I know she set out some requirements saying that students had to have a certain kind of dictionary, and Nick knows that that teacher is going to expect him to do a lot of things in the 5th grade. And that brought us to chapter 3, The Question. The first day of school was always a get acquainted day, and that means a getting to know you day. Books were passed out, and there was a lot of chatter, so a lot of talking. Everyone asked, "What did you do over the summer?" Periods 1 through 6 went by very smoothly for Nick. But then came period 7. I'll bet you can guess whose class that was, can't you? Mrs. Granger's class was all business. The first thing they did was take a vocabulary pretest to see how many of the 35 words for the week the kids already knew. Tremble, circular, orchestra. The list went on and on. Nick knew most of them. Then there was a handout about class procedures. After that, there was a review paper about cursive writing. Then there was a sample sheet showing how the heading, or the top of the paper, should look on every assignment. No let up for 37 minutes straight. Boy, it sounds like that Mrs. Granger really, really does expect a lot of her students, doesn't it? Nick was an expert at asking the delaying questions, also known as the teacher stopper or the guaranteed time waster. And if something is guaranteed, that's the sure thing. At 3 minutes before the bell, in that split second between the end of today's classwork and the announcement of tomorrow's homework, Nick could launch a question guaranteed to sidetrack the teacher, long enough to delay or even wipe out the homework assignment. Timing was important, but asking the right question, that was the hard part. Questions about stuff in the news, questions about the college the teacher went to, questions about the teacher's favorite book or sport or hobby. Oh, Nick knew all the tricks, and he had been very successful in the past. Here he was in 5th grade, near the end of his very first language arts class with Mrs. Granger. Oh, and Nick could feel a homework assignment coming the way a farmer can feel a rainstorm. Mrs. Granger paused to catch her breath, and Nick's hand shot up. She glanced down at her seating chart and then up at him. Her sharp gray eyes were not even turned up to half power. "Yes, Nicholas." "Mrs. Granger, you have so many dictionaries in this room, and that huge one especially. Where did all those words come from? Did they just get copied from other dictionaries? It sure is a big book." Oh, it was a perfect thought grenade. Kapow! Several kids smiled, and a few peeked at the clock. Oh, Nick was famous at this, and the whole class knew what he was doing. Unfortunately, so did Mrs. Granger. She hesitated, or paused, or a little stop for a moment, and she gave Nick a smile that was just a little too sweet to be real. Her eyes were the color of a thundercloud. "Why? That is an interesting question, Nicholas. I could talk about it for hours, I bet." And she glanced around the classroom. "Do the rest of you want to know too?" Everyone nodded yes. "Well, very well then, Nicholas. You will do some research on that subject and give a little oral report to the class. If you find out the answer yourself, it will mean so much more than if I just told you. Please have your report ready for our next class." Boy, she got old Nick on that one, didn't she? It backfired. Mrs. Granger smiled at him again, very sweetly. Then it was back to business. "Now, the homework for tomorrow can be found on page 12 of your Words Alive book." More to come. Nick barely heard the assignment. His heart was pounding. He felt small, very small. He could feel the tops of his ears glowing red. So what's the author trying to tell you? The author is showing, the author isn't telling. We're supposed to know. Listen to that again. He could feel the tops of his ears glowing red. Yeah, Nick's really embarrassed, isn't he? The author's showing us that. A complete shutdown, an extra assignment, and probably a little black mark next to his name on the seating chart. Everything he had heard about this teacher was true. Don't mess around with the lone Granger. And that is the end of chapter 3, bringing us to chapter 4, Word Detective. And I'll bet you know who the word detective is going to have to be, don't you? Yep, that's Nick. It was a beautiful September afternoon. Bright sun, cool breeze, blue sky. But not for Nick. Nick had to do a little report for the next day. Plus, copy out all the definitions or meanings of the word for 35 words for Mrs. Granger. This was not the way school was supposed to work. Not for Nick. There was a rule at Nick's house. Homework first. And that meant right after school. Nick had heard his older brother, James, groan and grumble about this rule for years, right up until he graduated from high school 2 years ago. And then James wrote home from college after his first semester and said, "My grades are looking great because when I came here, I already knew how to put first things first." That letter was the proof that Nick's mom and dad had been looking for. Homework first was the law from September to June. And you can see how Nick is feeling about the law, homework first. Boy, doesn't the illustrator do a great job showing us how Nick feels about that. This had never bothered Nick before because he hardly ever had homework. Oh, sure, he looked over his spelling words on Thursday nights, and there had been a few short book reports in 4th grade, but other than that, nothing. Up to now, schoolwork never spilled over into his free time. Thanks to Mrs. Granger, those days were gone. First, he looked up the definitions, or word meanings, in the brand new red dictionary that his mom had bought because Mrs. Granger told her to. It took almost an hour. He could hear a baseball game in John's yard down the street, yelling and shouting, and every few minutes the sharp crack of a bat connecting with a pitch. But he had a report to do for Mrs. Granger. Nick looked at the very front of the dictionary. There was an introduction to the book called Words and Their Origins. And you know, an origin is where it all began. Perfect, Nick thought. It was just what he needed to do his report. It would all be over in a few minutes. Nick could already feel the sun and the breeze on his face as he ran outside to play. Homework all done. And then he read the first sentence from the introduction. Without question, this modern American dictionary is one of the most surprisingly complex and profound documents ever to be created, for it embodies unparalleled etymological detail, reflecting not only superb lexicographic scholarship, but also the dreams and speech and imaginative talents of millions of people over thousands of years. For every person who has ever spoken or written in English has had a hand in its making. What? Nick scratched his head, and he read it again. And then again. Not much better. It was sort of like trying to read the ingredients on a shampoo bottle. He slammed the dictionary shut and walked downstairs. Nick's family did a lot of reading, so bookshelves covered 3 of the 4 walls in the family room. There were 2 sets of encyclopedias. Now, we've talked about what encyclopedias are before. Do you remember? You know, today we kind of turn to Google or Wikipedia. We just kind of do a Google search. But when I was young, I had to go to that bookshelf that had a book for letter A, a book for letter B, C, D, E, and everything you wanted to know about something that started with letter A was in that letter A book. Everything you wanted to know. So it's kind of like Google in book form, encyclopedias. So there were two sets of encyclopedias. The black set was for grown-ups, and the red set was for kids. Nick pulled out the D volume from the red set and looked up dictionary. There were 3 full pages with headings like early dictionaries, word detectives, and dictionaries today. Not very exciting, but he had to do it. So Nick just plopped down on the couch and read all of it. And when he was finished with the kids' book, he opened up the black encyclopedia and read most of what it said about dictionaries too. He understood only about half of what it said, of what he read. He leaned back on the couch and covered his eyes with his arm, trying to imagine himself giving a report on all this boring stuff. He'd be lucky to have 3 minutes worth. But because Nick was Nick, he suddenly had an idea. And it brought a grin to his face. What do you think Nick's idea is? Nick decided that giving this report could actually be fun. He could make it into something special. After all, Mrs. Granger had asked for it. And I'm going to leave you there until tomorrow. So be thinking, what is this idea that Nick has that Mrs. Granger asked for? What could be possibly fun about a book report on dictionaries or language? And that would bring us tomorrow to chapter 5, the report. Don't you read on. We'll read about it tomorrow. Have a great evening.